The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the small apartment as Sarah Chun stared at the eviction notice in her trembling hands. 3 months behind on rent, no job prospects, and a 6-year-old daughter who still believed everything would be okay. The paper felt heavy in her grip, heavier than it should have been for something so thin and ordinary. Maya sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, arranging her few remaining toys in careful rows. She had stopped asking why they kept moving from place to place, why Mama cried at night when she thought no one could hear. The little girl had developed an unsettling maturity, the kind that comes when childhood gets stolen too early. Sarah folded the notice and tucked it into her jacket pocket, next to the final disconnection warning from the electric company. The walls of their world were closing in, and she could feel the weight of every failed interview, every rejection letter, every door that had been slammed in her face over the past 8 months. The apartment complex where they lived was scheduled for demolition in 6 weeks. The landlord had made it clear that he wanted everyone out before then, legal or not. Most of the other tenants had already left, finding relatives to stay with or scraping together enough money for deposits elsewhere. Sarah had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Her phone buzzed with another call from a debt collector. She had stopped answering weeks ago. The voicemails piled up like digital stones, each one adding to the mountain of pressure that threatened to crush what remained of her hope. Maya looked up from her toys, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. She had inherited her father's intensity and her mother's stubborn streak, though she was too young to understand either trait fully. The father who had walked away when the medical bills became too much. The father who had promised to help, but disappeared when the promises became inconvenient. Sarah had learned not to mention him anymore, not even in her angriest moments. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the building. Water leaked through the ceiling in the corner, dripping into the plastic bucket Sarah had placed there months ago. The sound had become a constant rhythm in their lives, a metronome counting down to an ending she refused to accept. Sarah moved to the kitchen, such as it was. 3 cabinets, a small refrigerator that wheezed and struggled, and a stove with 2 working burners. She opened the cabinet where she kept their food, doing a mental inventory that had become a twice-daily ritual. Enough for maybe 4 more days if she stretched everything and ate less herself. The job interviews had stopped coming. Her degree in social work, once a source of pride, now felt like expensive paper that qualified her for nothing. Every position required experience she didn't have or connections she couldn't make. The few temporary jobs she had managed to land paid so little that childcare costs ate up most of her earnings. Maya had started asking about school. Registration was coming up, and Sarah knew she needed proof of residence, vaccination records, and school supplies she couldn't afford. The thought of explaining to her daughter why she couldn't start 1st grade made Sarah's chest tight with panic. She sat down at the small table they used for everything: meals, homework, craft projects, bill sorting. The surface was scarred from years of use by previous tenants, marked with ring stains and knife cuts that told stories of other lives, other struggles. The apartment management office had called that morning. Mrs. Rodriguez, the property manager, had been surprisingly gentle in her explanation of the situation. The building was sold, demolition permits were filed, and everyone had to be out within 45 days. No exceptions, no extensions, no matter what sob story anyone wanted to share. Sarah understood the business side of it. She had worked in systems long enough to know how these things operated. Numbers on spreadsheets, profit margins, development opportunities. Human stories didn't factor into real estate mathematics, but understanding didn't make it easier to figure out where they would sleep in 6 weeks. Maya appeared beside her chair, holding a drawing she had made with the last of their crayons. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with a house that had smoke curling from the chimney and flowers in neat rows around the front door. The little girl couldn't know that her simple picture contained everything her mother wanted but couldn't provide. Stability, security, a place to belong that nobody could take away. Sarah accepted the drawing and taped it to the refrigerator next to Maya's other artwork and the increasingly urgent notices from various agencies and companies. The colorful picture looked strange, surrounded by white and yellow papers covered in bold text and final warnings. The rain began to slow, though the wind continued to rattle the building. Sarah could hear their upstairs neighbor moving around, probably packing the last of his belongings. Mr. Patterson had found a place across town, though he had warned Sarah that the waiting list was months long and required references she didn't have. Tomorrow she would try again. More job applications, more phone calls, more closed doors, and polite rejections. Maya would come with her, because daycare was an impossible expense, and together they would walk through a city that had no place for them. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to sit in the growing darkness and feel the full weight of their situation. 10 minutes to acknowledge that she was failing at the most basic responsibility of parenthood, keeping her child safe and housed. Maya had fallen asleep on the couch, curled around a stuffed elephant that had seen better days. Sarah covered her with the quilt her grandmother had made, one of the few possessions she refused to sell no matter how desperate things became. The building settled around them with creaks and sighs. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed through the night. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine a different ending to their story, one where determination and hard work actually led to the life she had been promised they would create. When morning came, she would start over. She would make new plans, try new approaches, knock on different doors. She would do whatever it took to prove that giving up was not an option, not while Maya needed her to be strong. The eviction notice crinkled in her pocket as she shifted position. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they still had a roof over their heads and each other. For now, that would have to be enough. The social services office buzzed with the particular energy of desperation mixed with bureaucratic efficiency. Sarah sat in an orange plastic chair that had been designed more for durability than comfort. Maya beside her with a coloring book someone had left behind. The pages were already half used, but Maya carefully worked around the existing marks, creating new pictures in the remaining white spaces. Their caseworker, Janet Morrison, was a woman in her 50s who had seen every variation of human misfortune that could fit into a government filing system. She reviewed Sarah's paperwork with the methodical attention of someone who had learned that missing details could destroy lives. The Emergency Housing Assistance Program had a waiting list of 800 families. The Rapid Rehousing Program was suspended due to budget cuts. The Temporary Assistance Program required an address to receive benefits, which created an impossible circle for someone facing homelessness. Janet explained each program's requirements and limitations with professional kindness, but the mathematics were brutal and simple. Too many people needed help, and not enough resources existed to provide it. Sarah qualified for assistance that wouldn't be available for months, assuming the funding didn't get cut entirely. Maya looked up from her coloring book and asked if they were going to live in the car like the people she had seen in the parking lot. Sarah's throat closed around her response. She hadn't realized Maya had been paying such close attention to their situation. The job placement office was their next stop. The counselor there, a young man who looked like he had never missed a meal or worried about rent, reviewed Sarah's resume and made suggestions that revealed how little he understood about her reality. He recommended professional development courses that cost money she didn't have. He suggested networking events that required appropriate clothing and transportation she couldn't afford. He talked about building her brand and creating opportunities as if poverty was simply a marketing problem waiting for the right solution. Sarah nodded and took notes because burning bridges served no purpose, but inside she felt the familiar frustration of being treated like a puzzle that could be solved with the right combination of advice and effort. The counselor meant well, but good intentions didn't pay rent or put food on the table. The food bank was different. The volunteers there understood hunger in immediate, practical terms. They packed boxes without judgment and included extras when they could. Meyer received a small teddy bear from the children's corner, and Sarah got information about free meal programs and community resources. But even the food bank operated within limits. Families could visit once every 2 weeks, and the available food depended on donations that fluctuated based on factors completely outside anyone's control. Sarah learned to be grateful for what they received while calculating how to make it stretch until their next visit. The afternoon brought more rejection letters in their mailbox. Positions filled, budgets frozen, requirements not met. Each letter followed the same basic template, polite but firm in its finality. Sarah had learned not to take them personally, but the accumulated weight of constant rejection was eroding something essential inside her. Maya played with her new teddy bear, while Sarah called the few remaining numbers on her job search list. Most went to voicemail. The ones who answered spoke in the weary tones of people who had given the same disappointing news dozens of times that week. Their car broke down in the parking lot of the employment office. The engine made a grinding noise that even Sarah could identify as expensive trouble. The tow truck driver explained the problem in terms she understood. Major repairs that would cost more than the car was worth. Without transportation, the already narrow range of available jobs shrank to whatever existed within walking distance or on public transit routes. The bus system in their part of town ran infrequently, and many potential employers were located in areas that required multiple transfers and hours of commute time. Sarah sat in the disabled car and did the math that had become her constant companion. No job meant no money for car repairs. No car meant fewer job opportunities. Fewer opportunities meant longer unemployment. The spiral tightened with each calculation. Maya asked if they were going to walk everywhere now. Sarah explained that sometimes walking was an adventure, though she could see in her daughter's face that 6-year-olds were not easily convinced that losing their car was positive development. The mechanic who came to look at the engine was honest about the situation. The transmission was finished, and even if they could afford to fix it, other major systems were likely to fail soon. He recommended a salvage yard that would pay $50 for the car as scrap metal. $50 for their mobility, their last connection to the middle-class life Sarah had been building before everything fell apart. She signed the papers and watched the tow truck carry away another piece of their stability. The walk home took 40 minutes and included a stop at the public library where Maya could use the bathroom and Sarah could apply for more jobs online. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, seemed to understand their situation without needing explanations. She made sure Maya had access to children's books and quietly provided information about free community programs. Libraries had become Sarah's offices, her internet cafes, her safe spaces where being homeless wasn't immediately obvious to everyone around her. Maya had learned to entertain herself quietly while her mother typed applications and made phone calls on the public computers. That evening, their upstairs neighbor moved out. Mr. Patterson stopped by to say goodbye and pressed a $20 bill into Sarah's hand. He apologized that it wasn't more, but his own situation was precarious. The building felt more empty with his departure, as if each person who left took some of the remaining hope with them. Maya helped Sarah organize their belongings into categories: essential, important, and everything else. The everything else pile grew larger as they considered what they could carry versus what they might need. Every item represented a choice between practicality and sentiment. The stuffed elephant that had belonged to Maya since birth stayed in the essential pile. Sarah's grandmother's quilt stayed. Maya's favorite book stayed. Almost everything else moved to the donate pile, including kitchen items, decorative objects, and clothing that didn't fit anymore. Their life was becoming more portable, which felt like preparation for an ending Sarah didn't want to acknowledge. She had spent 32 years accumulating the possessions and connections that made a life stable and predictable. Now, she was learning to subtract everything that wasn't absolutely necessary for basic survival. The building manager called to remind them about the move-out deadline. 28 days remaining. Sarah marked on the calendar, though the number felt both urgent and meaningless. Urgency implied that enough effort could change the outcome. Meaningless suggested that the date would arrive regardless of what she did to prevent it. Maya fell asleep early, exhausted from walking and the general stress that children absorb from their environments, even when they don't understand its source. Sarah sat by the window and watched the city lights twinkle in the distance, each light representing someone's home, someone's place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new attempts, new strategies, new hopes that this time would be different. She would walk to job interviews, apply for assistance programs, and make phone calls to agencies that might have resources she hadn't discovered yet. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself to acknowledge that the systems designed to help people in her situation were failing her in specific, measurable ways. Not because people didn't care, but because the scale of need exceeded the capacity of resources, and good intentions couldn't bridge that gap. 28 days to find a miracle, or to accept that some stories don't have happy endings no matter how hard the characters fight to create them. The demolition notice appeared on their door on a Tuesday morning, bright orange and impossible to ignore. 7 days to vacate the premises. All remaining tenants must be out before the construction crews arrived to begin structural work. No exceptions, no negociations, no appeals. Sarah stared at the notice until the words blurred together. 7 days. 168 hours to find housing, transportation, and stability for herself and Maya. The mathematics of impossibility had never been more clear. Maya was spending the day with Mrs. Patterson from the library, part of an informal arrangement that gave Sarah time to handle adult business without exposing her daughter to the worst of their situation. The kindness of near strangers had become crucial to their survival. Though Sarah worried about the burden she was placing on people who barely knew them. The homeless shelter downtown had a waiting list longer than their time frame. The women's shelter required proof of domestic violence. The family shelter system was full, with average wait times measured in months rather than days. Sarah called every organization on the list the social worker had provided, but resources designed for emergency situations couldn't handle the volume of emergencies actually occurring. She walked through neighborhoods she couldn't afford, looking for rent signs and trying to calculate impossible budgets. Even the cheapest apartments required first month's rent, last month's rent, security deposits, and utility connections she couldn't establish. Landlords wanted credit checks, employment verification, and references she couldn't provide. The storage unit rental took most of her remaining cash. 5 feet by 8 feet of space to hold everything they couldn't carry. Sarah loaded boxes with their winter clothes, books, kitchen items, and photo albums while fighting the growing realization that she might never see these possessions again. Maya's drawings went in a careful folder at the top of one box. Her grandmother's quilt wrapped around items that needed extra protection. The practical mixed with the sentimental in ways that made every choice feel like a small betrayal of the life they used to have. The used car lot owner looked at Sarah's financial situation and shook his head with genuine sympathy. Even the cheapest, most broken-down vehicles required down payments she couldn't make and monthly payments she couldn't sustain. Transportation remained out of reach, which kept employment out of reach, which kept housing out of reach. Public transportation became her lifeline and her limitation. Bus routes determined where she could look for work and where they could feasibly live. The city's geography took on new meaning measured in walking distance and transfer points rather than convenience and preference. Maya returned from her day at the library with stories about the books Mrs. Patterson had read to her and the art project they had completed together. Her innocent excitement felt like both a gift and a weight. Sarah wanted to protect her daughter's ability to find joy in small things while preparing her for realities that no 6-year-old should have to face. The final job interview of the week was at a cleaning company that paid minimum wage and required evening shifts. The manager was honest about the position. Hard work, irregular hours, no benefits, and immediate termination for any absences. Sarah took detailed notes and nodded enthusiastically, though the job wouldn't start for 2 weeks and wouldn't pay enough to secure housing even if she worked every available hour. Wednesday brought the electricity disconnection. The apartment went dark, and quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. Maya adapted with the resilience of children, turning the situation into an adventure with flashlights and shadow puppet shows. Sarah marveled at her daughter's ability to find magic in circumstances that terrified her. They ate dinner by candlelight, using up the perishable food from the refrigerator before it spoiled completely. Maya declared it the best picnic they had ever had, sitting on the floor with sandwiches and warm juice while Sarah told stories she remembered from her own childhood. The building felt different without electricity. Sounds carried differently through the empty hallways. The remaining tenants moved like ghosts, packing and preparing for departures that felt more like evacuations than relocations. Thursday morning brought representatives from the demolition company. They walked through the building making notes, measuring spaces, and discussing timelines with the efficiency of people accustomed to erasing places where people used to live. Sarah watched them work and tried to understand how her home had become an obstacle to be removed. The community outreach worker who visited that afternoon had resources that sounded helpful until Sarah learned about their limitations. Emergency vouchers that required 30-day waits. Rapid rehousing programs with income requirements she couldn't meet. Transitional housing with rules that made long-term planning impossible. Maya spent the afternoon organizing her remaining toys by color, size, and emotional attachment. She created elaborate explanations for which items were most important and why, displaying the same methodical approach to crisis that Sarah recognized in herself. Friday brought the final notice. 48 hours to vacate. The building would be secured over the weekend, and anyone remaining after Sunday evening would be subject to trespassing charges. The legal language was clear and final. Sarah spent Friday evening walking through every room of their apartment, memorizing details she had stopped noticing during the months they had lived there. The way afternoon light fell across the kitchen table. The sound of floorboards made near Maya's bedroom door. The view from the living room window that included a small park where Maya had played countless times. Maya asked if they could take pictures of their home before they left. Sarah realized she had been so focused on practical preparations that she hadn't considered the emotional significance of this transition for her daughter. They spent Saturday morning documenting their life in the apartment, creating a record of a chapter that was ending whether they were ready or not. The final packing took most of Saturday. Everything they could carry fit into 4 bags and 2 small boxes. The rest went to the donation pile or the storage unit, sorted with the brutal efficiency that homelessness teaches. Need versus want. Essential versus convenient. Survival versus sentiment. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold, matching the weight of the day ahead. Sarah double-checked their preparations while Maya sat on the floor, surrounded by the possessions that would make the transition with them. 2 changes of clothes each. Basic toiletries. Maya's stuffed elephant and 3 books. Sarah's important papers in a waterproof folder. The building manager arrived at noon for the final walkthrough. She was professional and kind, understanding that Sarah had maintained the apartment well despite her circumstances. The deposit refund would be mailed to the post office box Sarah had rented for situations like this. Maya asked where they would sleep that night. Sarah had prepared for this question, though her answer felt inadequate even as she spoke it. They would stay with friends until they found something permanent. Everything would be okay. Things had a way of working out. But as they loaded their belongings into 2 shopping carts borrowed from the grocery store down the street, Sarah felt the full weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. No car, no home, no job, and no clear path forward. Just determination and love and the stubborn refusal to give up on the idea that tomorrow might be different than today. Maya took her mother's hand as they walked away from the building that had been their home. Behind them, workers were already installing security fencing and posting signs warning trespassers to stay away. The demolition would begin Wednesday morning, erasing the last physical evidence of their time there. But they were still together, still fighting, still believing in endings that hadn't been written yet. And sometimes, Sarah thought, as they made their way toward an uncertain night, Stubborn hope was enough to keep moving forward even when the destination remained invisible in the distance. The military recruitment office was not where Sarah had expected to find herself on a Wednesday afternoon, but desperation had a way of expanding the boundaries of possibility. She stood outside the building for 10 minutes. Maya, beside her, clutching her stuffed elephant, both of them trying to understand how their situation had led them to this particular doorway. Colonel Marcus Webb had been watching them through the window of his office for the past 5 minutes. 23 years in the Army had taught him to recognize people who were out of options, though he had never seen someone quite like the woman standing on the sidewalk with a small child and 2 overloaded shopping carts. Sarah finally pushed through the glass doors, Maya following closely behind. The air conditioning hit them like a wall of relief after days of walking in the summer heat. The recruitment office was clean and organized in a way that felt foreign after weeks of navigating systems that barely functioned. The receptionist, Sergeant Jennifer Martinez, looked up from her computer screen and immediately recognized the signs of someone who had been living rough. She had grown up in foster care and understood the particular exhaustion that came from having nowhere to go. Sarah approached the desk with the careful politeness of someone who had been disappointed many times, but couldn't afford to burn any bridges. She explained that she was interested in learning about opportunities in the military, though she wasn't sure if her situation qualified her for consideration. Sergeant Martinez listened without judgment as Sarah outlined their circumstances. Evicted 3 days ago, staying at a church shelter that could only house them for one more night. No car, no job, no permanent address, and no family support system. A 6-year-old daughter who needed stability and school enrollment in 2 weeks. Colonel Webb emerged from his office during this conversation. He was a man in his late 40s who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to solving problems that other people considered impossible. He invited Sarah and Maya into his office, though military regulations didn't typically include provisions for homeless mothers seeking guidance. Maya settled into a chair that was too big for her while Sarah outlined her background. Degree in social work. Previous employment in community organizations. No criminal history. No debt beyond normal poverty. No substance abuse issues. Just a series of circumstances that had accumulated into homelessness despite her best efforts to prevent it. Colonel Webb had seen plenty of young recruits who joined the military to escape poverty, but Sarah's situation was different. She wasn't looking for adventure or education benefits. She was looking for survival, and her daughter was part of the equation in ways that complicated standard recruitment procedures. The military offered solutions to some of their problems, but created others. Basic training would separate Sarah from Maya for several months. Housing and healthcare would be provided eventually, but not immediately. Education benefits and stable employment would come with commitments measured in years rather than months. Maya colored quietly in the corner while the adults discussed options that would fundamentally change their lives. She had become skilled at entertaining herself during these conversations, though Sarah could see that the constant uncertainty was taking its toll on her daughter's natural exuberance. Colonel Webb made several phone calls while Sarah filled out preliminary paperwork. He spoke in the efficient military language of problem solving, exploring options that existed outside normal procedures. Sarah caught fragments of conversations about family readiness programs, emergency assistance funds, and temporary childcare arrangements. The first breakthrough came when Sergeant Martinez mentioned the Family Liaison Program at the nearby base. Military families sometimes needed childcare assistance, and the program occasionally matched civilians with families who could provide temporary housing in exchange for babysitting or household help. Colonel Webb's second phone call reached Captain Lisa Rodriguez, whose husband was deployed and who had been struggling to manage her own 2 children while working full-time. She had recently inquired about assistance through the Family Support Network, though she hadn't expected to be connected with someone in Sarah's situation. Captain Rodriguez arrived at the recruitment office an hour later. She was a woman in her early 30s with the competent efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex logistics on short notice. She listened to Sarah's story with the practical attention of someone who understood that life rarely followed predictable patterns. The arrangement they discussed was unconventional but mutually beneficial. Sarah and Maya could stay in Captain Rodriguez's guest room temporarily in exchange for childcare assistance and help with household management. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it provided immediate stability while longer-term options were explored. Maya perked up when she learned that Captain Rodriguez had children close to her age. The prospect of playmates and a stable place to sleep seemed to unlock some of the enthusiasm that had been suppressed by weeks of uncertainty. The paperwork for military consideration would take several weeks to process, but Colonel Webb expedited what he could. Sarah's background check came back clean, her education credentials were verified, and her physical health assessment was scheduled for the following week. The delayed entry program allowed recruits to prepare for basic training while maintaining civilian status. Sarah could begin military preparation while Maya settled into a stable environment. Basic training would still require separation, but the family readiness program could provide childcare support during that period. Captain Rodriguez lived in base housing 20 minutes from the recruitment office. The neighborhood was clean and safe in ways that had become foreign to Sarah after months of navigating environments where security was never guaranteed. Children played in yards while parents watched from porches, a vision of normalcy that felt almost surreal. Maya's reaction to the house was immediate and obvious. She had forgotten what it felt like to have space to move freely, to know that the adults around her weren't worried about where they would sleep that night. She explored the guest room with careful delight, touching furniture and testing the stability of a bed that didn't fold up during the day. Captain Rodriguez's children, Emma and Carlos, were 8 and 6 years old respectively. They accepted Maya's presence with the easy adaptability of military children who were accustomed to changing circumstances and new arrangements. Within an hour, the 3 children were collaborating on an elaborate game that involved stuffed animals and building blocks. Sarah unpacked their belongings for the first time in weeks. For bags and 2 boxes spread across a real bedroom with a door that closed and windows that let in natural light. The luxury of privacy and space felt overwhelming after the constant public exposure of homelessness. Dinner was a revelation. A full meal prepared in a real kitchen, eaten at a table designed for families, with children who laughed and shared stories about their day. Maya participated with an enthusiasm that reminded Sarah how much her daughter had been holding back during their crisis. Colonel Webb called that evening to check on the transition and to discuss next steps. The military timeline moved more quickly than civilian bureaucracy, but still required careful planning to coordinate Sarah's training with Maya's needs. Foster care was not an option anyone wanted to pursue, so creative solutions were essential. The church shelter director was relieved to hear about Sarah's new situation. Their bed could go to another family that night, and the staff could focus resources on people who had fewer options available. Small victories in a system that rarely produced happy endings. Maya fell asleep easily for the first time in weeks, surrounded by the security of 4 walls and a locked door. Sarah sat beside her daughter's bed and allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten, hope that wasn't desperate, planning that extended beyond the next 24 hours. Captain Rodriguez joined Sarah in the living room after the children were settled. They discussed practical arrangements and discovered unexpected compatibility. Both women understood responsibility, adaptability, and the particular challenges of building stability in circumstances that other people designed. The military represented structure, purpose, and guaranteed housing that couldn't be taken away by landlords or economic downturns. Basic training would be difficult, but Sarah had already proven her ability to endure hardship. The separation from Maya would be painful, but temporary, with a clear end date and reunion planned. Colonel Webb had given Sarah materials to study before her formal testing, but more importantly, he had given her something she hadn't experienced in months, adults who were invested in her success rather than obligated to document her failures. Sarah opened the military preparation handbook and began reading about a future that finally seemed possible to achieve. Outside, the base was quiet and secure, with patrol cars making regular rounds and families sleeping peacefully behind locked doors. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and continued uncertainties, but tonight Sarah and Maya were safe, warm, and surrounded by people who understood that sometimes unconventional solutions were the only ones that actually worked 6 months later. Colonel Webb stood at the window of his office watching Sarah Chun lead a group of new recruits through morning exercises. Her transformation from desperate homeless mother to confident military leader had been remarkable, but it was the way she carried herself now that caught his attention. There was steel in her spine that hadn't been there during that first desperate visit to his recruitment office. Maya had thrived in the structured environment of base life. Captain Rodriguez had become more than a temporary housing solution. She had become family in the way that military communities created bonds that transcended traditional relationships. The 3 children had formed a unit that functioned with impressive cooperation and mutual support. Sarah's performance during basic training had been exceptional, though Colonel Webb wasn't surprised. Someone who had survived homelessness with a child while maintaining hope and dignity possessed reserves of strength that most people never discovered. The physical challenges were significant, but the mental toughness required was something Sarah had already proven she possessed. The specialized training program that followed basic training had been Sarah's choice. Military social work allowed her to use her civilian education while serving families who faced many of the same challenges she had experienced. Her unique background gave her credibility and understanding that textbook training couldn't provide. Maya started first grade at the base elementary school in September. Her teacher, Mrs. Williams, reported that she was a serious student who helped other children with kindness and patience unusual for someone her age. The stability of the past 6 months had allowed Maya's natural personality to emerge from the protective shell she had developed during their crisis. The housing assignment came through in October. A 2-bedroom apartment in family housing, with a real kitchen, reliable utilities, and neighbors who understood the challenges of military life. Sarah and Maya moved in with excitement that felt almost surreal after the uncertainty they had endured. Colonel Webb had been tracking Sarah's progress, not just as a successful recruitment story, but as something that had challenged his understanding of what military service could mean. He had spent decades working with young people who saw the military as escape from poverty or opportunity for advancement, but Sarah's motivation had been more fundamental: survival and protection for her child. The conversation that would change everything began on a Thursday afternoon when Sarah requested a meeting to discuss her long-term career plans. Colonel Webb expected routine questions about advancement opportunities or education benefits, but Sarah had something different in mind. She had been researching military family support programs and had identified gaps in services for families experiencing housing insecurity and financial crisis. Her proposal was detailed and practical. Expand the Family Liaison Program to include emergency housing assistance, create partnerships with civilian social services agencies, and establish rapid response protocols for military families facing homelessness. The presentation Sarah delivered was thorough and professionally prepared, but it was her personal testimony that gave it power. She spoke about the specific failures in civilian support systems that had led to her homelessness, the barriers that prevented access to existing assistance programs, and the ways that military structure could address problems that overwhelmed civilian agencies. Colonel Webb listened with growing respect and recognition. Sarah wasn't just describing problems she had read about in reports. She was outlining solutions based on lived experience that most policymakers never encountered. Her recommendations addressed real gaps with practical strategies that could be implemented within existing military framework. The program proposal went up the chain of command with Colonel Webb's strong endorsement. Sarah's background gave weight to recommendations that might otherwise be dismissed as theoretical or unrealistic. Military leadership understood the value of preventing family crises that could impact service member performance and retention. Maya's progress continued to amaze everyone who worked with her. She had developed leadership qualities that emerged naturally in group settings, helping classmates and organizing playground activities with the confidence of someone who had learned early that taking care of others was both responsibility and privilege. The official approval for Sarah's family support program expansion came through in December, along with her assignment to lead the implementation. Colonel Webb delivered the news personally, though he found himself struggling with emotions that professional military bearing didn't typically accommodate. Sarah's reaction was quiet and thoughtful rather than celebratory. She asked detailed questions about timeline, resources, and administrative support that demonstrated her understanding of the complexity involved in changing military systems. But Colonel Webb could see the satisfaction in her expression, the recognition that her experience had value beyond survival. The program launch was scheduled for January, with Sarah leading a team that would coordinate emergency assistance, temporary housing, and family crisis intervention for military families throughout the region. Her civilian education, military training, and personal experience created qualifications that couldn't be replicated through traditional career development. Maya attended the program announcement ceremony, sitting in the front row with Captain Rodriguez's children and wearing a dress that Sarah had bought for the occasion. Watching her daughter in that setting, surrounded by military families who had become their extended community, Sarah felt a completion that had nothing to do with career achievement. Colonel Webb's speech that day focused on innovation, adaptability, and the military's responsibility to care for families as well as service members. But his eyes kept returning to Sarah, sitting in the audience with the quiet confidence of someone who had transformed crisis into purpose. The private conversation that followed the ceremony was one that Colonel Webb would remember for the rest of his career. Sarah thanked him for taking a chance on someone whose circumstances didn't fit standard recruitment profiles, but her gratitude was secondary to what she had accomplished with the opportunity. Colonel Webb found himself struggling to articulate his response. In 23 years of military service, he had seen courage in many forms, but Sarah's journey from homelessness to program leadership represented something that challenged his understanding of strength and resilience. Sarah had been pushed to an edge that most people never experienced, forced to make choices between impossible alternatives while maintaining responsibility for another person's welfare. Her survival hadn't been guaranteed by determination alone, but her refusal to surrender had created opportunities that transformed crisis into victory. The victory wasn't measured in rank advancement or career achievement, though those were significant. The victory was in the program that would prevent other families from experiencing the desperation that had brought Sarah to his recruitment office. The victory was in Maya's confident smile as she played with friends in a safe environment. The victory was in the proof that human dignity could survive circumstances designed to destroy it. Colonel Webb realized that his own understanding had been transformed by witnessing Sarah's journey. Military service had always been about honor, duty, and service to country, but Sarah had demonstrated that those concepts could be embodied by someone whose primary motivation was protecting her child and helping other families avoid the crisis she had survived. The program that Sarah developed would eventually be implemented across multiple military installations, serving hundreds of families and preventing homelessness that could have destroyed military careers and family stability. But the real victory was more personal and more profound than policy implementation. Maya grew up understanding that strength could be quiet and determined rather than loud and dramatic. She learned that helping others wasn't optional when you had the ability to make a difference. She absorbed lessons about resilience, dignity, and hope that would guide her through whatever challenges her own life would present. Sarah's story became part of military training programs, though she insisted that the focus remain on systematic solutions rather than individual inspiration. She understood that structural problems required structural solutions, not just inspiring examples of personal triumph over adversity. But Colonel Webb knew that some victories transcended their immediate circumstances and challenged observers to reconsider their assumptions about strength, success, and service. Sarah Chun had been pushed to an edge that revealed capacities she hadn't known she possessed, and her victory had moved the soul of a career military officer who thought he had seen everything human nature could produce. Years later, when Colonel Webb reflected on his military career, he would identify Sarah's journey as the moment when his understanding of leadership had been fundamentally transformed. Not because she had overcome impossible odds, but because she had done so while maintaining her humanity, her dignity, and her commitment to ensuring that other families wouldn't have to endure what she and Maya had survived. The Edge had revealed who Sarah really was, and her victory had demonstrated that sometimes the most profound strength came from refusing to let impossible circumstances destroy hope for a better future. The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the small apartment as Sarah Chun stared at the eviction notice in her trembling hands. 3 months behind on rent, no job prospects, and a 6-year-old daughter who still believed everything would be okay. The paper felt heavy in her grip, heavier than it should have been for something so thin and ordinary. Maya sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, arranging her few remaining toys in careful rows. She had stopped asking why they kept moving from place to place, why Mama cried at night when she thought no one could hear. The little girl had developed an unsettling maturity, the kind that comes when childhood gets stolen too early. Sarah folded the notice and tucked it into her jacket pocket, next to the final disconnection warning from the electric company. The walls of their world were closing in, and she could feel the weight of every failed interview, every rejection letter, every door that had been slammed in her face over the past 8 months. The apartment complex where they lived was scheduled for demolition in 6 weeks. The landlord had made it clear that he wanted everyone out before then, legal or not. Most of the other tenants had already left, finding relatives to stay with or scraping together enough money for deposits elsewhere. Sarah had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Her phone buzzed with another call from a debt collector. She had stopped answering weeks ago. The voicemails piled up like digital stones, each one adding to the mountain of pressure that threatened to crush what remained of her hope. Maya looked up from her toys, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. She had inherited her father's intensity and her mother's stubborn streak, though she was too young to understand either trait fully. The father who had walked away when the medical bills became too much. The father who had promised to help, but disappeared when the promises became inconvenient. Sarah had learned not to mention him anymore, not even in her angriest moments. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the building. Water leaked through the ceiling in the corner, dripping into the plastic bucket Sarah had placed there months ago. The sound had become a constant rhythm in their lives, a metronome counting down to an ending she refused to accept. Sarah moved to the kitchen, such as it was. 3 cabinets, a small refrigerator that wheezed and struggled, and a stove with 2 working burners. She opened the cabinet where she kept their food, doing a mental inventory that had become a twice-daily ritual. Enough for maybe 4 more days if she stretched everything and ate less herself. The job interviews had stopped coming. Her degree in social work, once a source of pride, now felt like expensive paper that qualified her for nothing. Every position required experience she didn't have or connections she couldn't make. The few temporary jobs she had managed to land paid so little that childcare costs ate up most of her earnings. Maya had started asking about school. Registration was coming up, and Sarah knew she needed proof of residence, vaccination records, and school supplies she couldn't afford. The thought of explaining to her daughter why she couldn't start first grade made Sarah's chest tight with panic. She sat down at the small table they used for everything: meals, homework, craft projects, bill sorting. The surface was scarred from years of use by previous tenants, marked with ring stains and knife cuts that told stories of other lives, other struggles. The apartment management office had called that morning. Mrs. Rodriguez, the property manager, had been surprisingly gentle in her explanation of the situation. The building was sold, demolition permits were filed, and everyone had to be out within 45 days. No exceptions, no extensions, no matter what sob story anyone wanted to share. Sarah understood the business side of it. She had worked in systems long enough to know how these things operated. Numbers on spreadsheets, profit margins, development opportunities. Human stories didn't factor into real estate mathematics, but understanding didn't make it easier to figure out where they would sleep in 6 weeks. Maya appeared beside her chair, holding a drawing she had made with the last of their crayons. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with a house that had smoke curling from the chimney and flowers in neat rows around the front door. The little girl couldn't know that her simple picture contained everything her mother wanted but couldn't provide. Stability, security, a place to belong that nobody could take away. Sarah accepted the drawing and taped it to the refrigerator next to Maya's other artwork and the increasingly urgent notices for various agencies and companies. The colorful picture looked strange, surrounded by white and yellow papers covered in bold text and final warnings. The rain began to slow, though the wind continued to rattle the building. Sarah could hear their upstairs neighbor moving around, probably packing the last of his belongings. Mr. Patterson had found a place across town, though he had warned Sarah that the waiting list was months long and required references she didn't have. Tomorrow she would try again. More job applications, more phone calls, more closed doors, and polite rejections. Maya would come with her, because daycare was an impossible expense, and together they would walk through a city that had no place for them. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to sit in the growing darkness and feel the full weight of their situation. 10 minutes to acknowledge that she was failing at the most basic responsibility of parenthood, keeping her child safe and housed. Maya had fallen asleep on the couch, curled around a stuffed elephant that had seen better days. Sarah covered her with the quilt her grandmother had made, one of the few possessions she refused to sell, no matter how desperate things became. The building settled around them with creaks and sighs. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed through the night. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine a different ending to their story, one where determination and hard work actually led to the life she had been promised they would create. When morning came, she would start over. She would make new plans, try new approaches, knock on different doors. She would do whatever it took to prove that giving up was not an option, not while Maya needed her to be strong. The eviction notice crinkled in her pocket as she shifted position. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they still had a roof over their heads and each other. For now, that would have to be enough.